Exclusive corporate funding for American Experience is provided by Liberty Mutual. Major funding is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you. Thank you.
Would all the sit-downers please stand up?
More than 50 years ago, these people organized the automobile workers into a union and changed the lives of working people forever. They did it by the simple act of sitting down. The sit-down strike was the most powerful weapon that labor ever had. The entire machinery of production was held hostage to the demands of the workers. By doing nothing, they achieved everything.
1933, and I got in the union in 36.
These women did more than join the union. While the men were occupying the factories, the women walked the picket lines and faced the police alone. Before they resorted to the sit-down strike, they tried again and again to organize inside the plants. Each time they were fired and forced to take their battle into the streets.
The entire society was opposed to it. The judges, the whole system was stacked against you. Every police department, including the police department of the city of Detroit, always wound up on the employer's side, try to break strikes, try to break picket lines. That was the environment in which we lived. It was a one-sided situation.
The VFW, Veterans Foreign Wars, American Legion, all organizations were openly against us. We didn't have the support of a damn thing. And that's discouraging too, you know. It makes you think, well, you know, are we right or wrong, all these damn people against us? But we didn't have any. No one stood with us, we stood alone.
In 10 years, membership in the United Automobile Workers Union would grow from less than 1,000 to more than 1 million. They would develop a voice powerful enough to be heard above the machinery of mass production. This is the story of all these people building all these cars. It began with one man and one car. When Henry Ford took his wife Clara for a ride in his first car, he had no idea that his creation would lead to violent labor struggles in the years ahead. Ford's first cars were all made by hand. Skilled craftsmen put the Model T together part by part. But Ford longed for a way to make cars faster and cheaper. He invented the assembly line and turned workers into machines.
He organized a production system that sacrificed bodies for speed, whereby everybody on the line got the same thing and everybody moved at the same pace. And I mean, they moved. The speed up was intolerable almost.
For every 9 workers that Ford hired, 8 would quit within a year. They couldn't take the speed and the monotony of the assembly line, and they didn't have to. Times were good, jobs were plentiful. Then something happened that changed all that.
If I had my way, dear, forever there'd be a garden of roses for you and for me.
The Depression hit Detroit with terrible consequences. Between 1929 and 1933, production of automobiles dropped from 5 million to 2 million. 1/3 of all wage earners were unemployed. 200,000 people were on relief, and every day, 4,000 children stood on bread lines.
And, you know, it was a very unnerving thing because the unemployed would come around, hang around, look through the windows, and it was a constant reminder that if you didn't behave yourself, there were lots there to take your place.
They had the most terrible conditions of any plant, in the Ford Rouge plant. Because even if you were in the toilet and you had diarrhea, they'd go in there. If you were in there, he'd grab you off the toilet and throw you out of the toilet. Didn't matter what the situation was. That's the way the servicemen treated the people there.
You woke up with a sense of dread, but you knew you had to do it or else you didn't eat, you know.
A young tool and die maker, lucky to have a job at the Ford River Rouge plant, was making a favorable impression on management.
I remember the superintendent came to me one time and he said, makes me feel real good to see a young fellow like you going to school and working hard. He said, and someday, he said, you'll be the vice president of this company. I figured, little did he understand what plans I had in mind.
What Reuther had in mind was a new society that he believed would protect the rights of working people. He was born into a family of socialists. As a young man, he would work for a year in a Russian auto plant. His father, Valentine, was a dedicated trade union activist who passed on his values to his sons.
My father was really the prime influence in terms of our social philosophy. His socialism was really based upon a Christian philosophy rather than based upon a Marxist concept. He knew very little of Marx. Why shouldn't you produce things for people rather than for profits? I mean, this was the kind of philosophy he had.
In the 1932 presidential election, Reuther campaigned for the socialist candidate Norman Thomas. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt won overwhelmingly. He had promised the working people a New Deal.
The workers of this country want representation. They want organization. They want participation. They want protection. They want employment. And they're going to have those things through the leadership and the instrumentality of this new labor movement that you're forging.
In 1935, the Wagner Act guaranteed workers the right to organize. John L. Lewis established the CIO, the Committee for Industrial Organization, and began to organize the auto workers for an assault on the 3 most powerful automobile companies in America.
He then began to look around, and there weren't any organizers. The only ones who knew how to organize were either communists or socialists or had some other, this is in the depth of the Depression.
John L. Lewis was certainly no communist. But in a battle, he said, you make arrows from any wood. In 1936, the fledgling auto union gathered in South Bend, Indiana, and began to plan their strategy for organizing the auto industry. The United Automobile Workers, the UAW, was born.
Homer Martin was elected president. He was a very glamorous person. He was an ex-preacher, wonderful platform man. He had made a speech or two, and the workers said, oh boy, that's our man. He'll be our president. There were all kinds of people for the first time. Walter Reuther, for instance, appears for the first time as a leading person. He was elected as one of the members of the executive board at South Bend.
Walter Reuther began organizing in Detroit. He demonstrated his shrewdness in the selection of his first target. Instead of confronting the giant Ford Motor Company directly, he would get at Ford through a vital supplier, the Kelsey Hayes Wheel Company. They manufactured Ford's brake shoes. Without brake shoes, Ford couldn't make cars. One of the organizers inside Kelsey Hayes was Reuther's brother.
There was a woman working next to me, a young mother who I think had real worries at home about whether her children were being cared for because, you know, there are no daycare centers and maybe she didn't have a mother around to care for them, but every time I conversed with her, her concern was about her children and she needed the job. She was under incredible pressure and she produced more pieces per hour than I did. Her fingers were more nimble, but she only got 21.5 cents an hour and I got 32.5 cents an hour. I don't know what these half cents were for, but women automatically, even when they did more work than men at a job, were automatically paid less. One day she was under such terrible pressure she fainted. Walter said, "We've got to do something dramatic."
Instead of sending pickets to march outside the plant, he would use a revolutionary new tactic, the sit-down strike. A small group of people could bring production to a halt by sitting down inside the plant. The woman who had fainted was the perfect person to spark the strike.
And he turned to this young mother and he said, "Do you think you could faint again, but on schedule?" And the change of shift came on Tuesday and she fainted and I walked over and pulled the main switch. And the superintendent of the whole department came pounding down, threatening people they're going to be fired if they didn't go back to work. And he came over and raised hell with me. He said, "He's going to be fired, get back to work." And I said, "No, there's only one person who can get him back to work." "Who in the hell's that?" I said, "His name's Walter Reuther, and here's his telephone number." And Walter was sitting, waiting for the call.
The workers were startled to discover that they had actually stopped production. They held the plant for 9 days. Ford threatened to take its business elsewhere, and Kelsey Hayes was forced to settle with the union.
Today are here again, the stars above are clear again.
The UAW won the right to organize and an increase in pay for all workers. And Walter Reuther won his first victory. The UAW was on its way. Its next objective, to organize the mammoth General Motors complex in Flint, Michigan. GM was now the largest auto manufacturer in the world.
We were worried, how are we going to tackle Flint with 42,000 workers, a city that was really like almost a feudal domain of General Motors. They controlled everything there.
The city of Flint had passed an ordinance that only two could meet, you know, and stop and talk on the streets, and they'd break it up. And they'd break it up if three of you stopped, they'd be bound until you break it up.
Threatened by a hostile police force and constantly watched by company spies, the union organizers were forced to hold secret meetings. Slowly, they built a core of men they could trust.
The break came one day in December. Workers at the Fisher body plant punched in as usual. An ordinary day. Then something happened. Or rather, nothing happened. Nothing moved. The workers had sat down. They would not work, and they would stay in the factory until General Motors signed a contract with their union.
When they tie a can to a union man,
sit down, sit down.
When they give him the sack, they'll take him back.
Sit down, sit down, sit down, just take a seat. Sit down and rest your feet. Sit down, you've got 'em beat. Sit down, sit down.
When they smile and say, no raise in pay.
Sit down!
Sit down! When you want the boss to come across, sit down! Sit down!
Sit down, just take a seat. Sit down and rest your feet. Sit down, you've got 'em beat. Sit down, sit down.
On January 4th, 1937, GM went to court and obtained an injunction ordering the strikers to leave the plant. It was issued by a local judge.
The union attorneys discovered that he was had a massive holding of GM stock, which he had not bothered to disclose, although he was sitting in judgment on a GM matter of interest.
GM tried a new tactic. They turned off the heat in the plant and blocked food deliveries to the sit-downers. A committee of strikers went to the main gate to see what was going on.
And they go down. There's not a single factory policeman in view. They had all retreated to the women's restroom because they didn't want to be present when the attack came on the building. And that was a warning to us that something was about to happen.
The men waited. At dusk, they saw the Flint police approaching in full riot gear. They attacked with tear gas and guns. The battle lasted into the morning hours. Ironically, GM supplied the strikers weapons, slingshots fashioned from inner tubes. For ammunition, the workers used car door hinges. Each hinge weighed 1.5 pounds. 14 workers were wounded by police gunfire, but the strikers had prevailed. The police retreated to the far shore of the Flint River. The Battle of the Running Bulls was the strikers' first victory, but the strike was not over. The next day, January 12th, the strikers watched silently as the National Guard rolled into Flint and set up machine guns.
And they marched the National Guards up about 100 feet from us, and the commander commanded them to fix bayonets. So they put the bayonets, and those guns were loaded, too. Those rifles were loaded. I said, you better give the command to take those bayonets off of those guns there, or we're going to march in between them, and we're going to take the bayonets off, and we're going to shove them right down their throat. Now, if you think we're fooling, you're crazy as hell. They just marched right in between the National Guard. And these National Guards, some of them in their teens. And it was 5 degrees above zero, but they were sweating. And we went back to the commander and said, now, as far as we're concerned, this is a peaceful sit-down strike. And we're here in support of that strike. And we're going to do everything necessary to see that they win the strike. We don't care if it's the National Guards or who it is. So he gave the order to take the bayonets off the rifles, stand at ease, and he told the fellas going back on the picket line.
As the sit-down continued in Flint, Walter Reuther began calling support strikes at GM plants in Detroit. Cadillac and Fleetwood sat down. In Oakland, California, Atlanta, Georgia, Kansas City, Missouri, Cleveland, Ohio, and Anderson, Indiana, strikes paralyzed the General Motors operations nationwide. But GM refused to yield.
As the days go by, you wonder, when the company's going to start bending. And isn't the company going to face the reality? They're going to have to recognize us. And you have all this confidence, and as days go on, you wonder how it's going to end. Is this company just going to hold out forever?
The strike was in its 29th day, and the men in the plant were beginning to feel the strain of separation from family and friends.
We never expected to have a strike that long. We thought, my God, how are we going to keep them in? But here, this was on for over a month, so we said something has to be done to to add spirit to the strike and give it a lift.
The strike leaders devised a secret plan to deliver a crippling blow to the heart of the General Motors operation. Their target was a vital and heavily guarded building, GM Engine Plant Number 4. To draw the guards away from the engine plant, they staged a mock strike at Plant Number 9. Even the men in Plant 9 thought that this was a real strike. Union leaders hoped that they would fight just long enough for the UAW to take control of the engine plant.
It was announced that we were going in front of Chevy 9, and all the women, it was a tremendous picket line, you know, were standing there right in front, and we had clubs, you know, just for the sake of having clubs. We didn't know what we were going to use for them. Then suddenly, one of the strikers in Chevy 9 broke the window, and he yelled out, "The guards are choking us." Yes. And that was gas. All of us dashed and broke all the windows possible.
The battle in Plant 9 raged for 45 minutes, and many inside were severely beaten, but the plan worked. The engine plant, left unguarded, was seized.
How could anybody absolutely just fall for something like that? All right, they didn't know what was going to happen. But to take the 200 police that they had in Chevy 4 and to take them out and just put them, why didn't they leave 200 here and 200 in another place, you know? Well, they didn't. They absolutely were stupid.
When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater any.
The union had forced the largest automaker in the world to the bargaining table. On February 11th, 1937, General Motors and the UAW signed a single-page contract. GM was the first of the big three to recognize the union.
Solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. They have taken millions from us that they never toiled to earn.
You know, you were there for over a month, never sleeping, never eating, never knowing what was going to happen the next day, you know. You were just sort of as if you were in a dream, really. And then suddenly it happened, you know. They came out. You saw them coming out, you know. It was just wonderful.
Solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong.
100 years from now, the effect of what we did in 37 will still be going on. I'm sure of that, because we were the forerunners of the civil rights, equal rights, and we went down for the rights of our sisters to belong to the union and join it and work with us.
Labor's sit-down hysteria spreads. At the height of the strike that closed 4 of Detroit's leading hotels for 2 days, armed police blocked the doors. 2,500 guests have had to leave. Waitresses, cooks, and bellhops refuse to work, but find time for play. Mrs. Martin Johnson, crippled widow of the late explorer, is one of the guests compelled to move out. In the arms of an obliging cop, Mrs. Johnson takes her troubles quite cheerfully. Ethel Chate, famous radio singer, has just arrived. The law says she shall not pass, so Ethel decides on a sit-down of her own.
After the sit-down strike, people organized themselves. They came by literally the tens of thousands, and all kinds of people. They were all joining the CIO. They weren't joining the UAW or this, that, the other union. They were joining the CIO. It was a crusade.
Everybody sat down. In Detroit, all 9 Chrysler factories sat down, and Chrysler signed within a month. the second of the big auto companies had recognized the union. In 1 year's time, the membership of the UAW had grown to 250,000 strong, and a local business weekly declared, "The revolution is here." The UAW was finally ready to face the last of the big three, the company that started it all, Ford. Ford had developed one of the largest and most powerful private security forces in the world. It was headed by Harry Bennett. An ex-Navy boxer, Bennett liked to brag to Henry Ford about his underworld connections. Convicts were paroled to the Ford Motor Company for rehabilitation under Bennett's supervision. They formed the core of the private army that protected Fortress Ford. On May 26, 1937, Walter Reuther obtained a permit to hand out leaflets at the Ford overpass during a shift change. He and another UAW official, Richard Frankenstein, went to the Rouge plant. Bennett's goons stood by, ready to attack.
The printer was late in delivering the handbill, so the reporters were apprehensive and impatient because they needed some pictures for their deadline edition. So they talked Walter and Frankenstein into going up on the overpass and they were to pretend like they were handing out handbills. In the meantime, the company's watching every move that's going on. They're watching from the plant. Yeah, they got their picture. They really did. That's a famous picture went around the world.
Only one roll of film survived, but it was enough. Time magazine ran an account of the attack. For the first time, the country became aware of the viciousness of Ford's private army. Still, Ford would manage to fend off the UAW for another 3 years, and no one was ever prosecuted for the attack.
Oh, that picture, the way it was used, you know, to Walter's advantage. They forgot about Frankenstein, who was leading the fight. This projected Walter Reuther eventually into the presidency of the UAW.
Reuther's presidency was still a long way off. The UAW now had 300,000 members, but a power struggle for control of the union suddenly threatened to destroy it. The president of the UAW, Homer Martin, reacting to real and imagined threats to his leadership, began to behave in a most erratic way.
He was a basket case. There was a drugstore under the Hoffman building. They had the UAW headquarters. And he'd get up on the stools there preaching the gospel. And he'd get right up on top of the counter, and he's walking up and down the counters. They were eating sodas and things like that and having a snack. And he's preaching the gospel to them, man.
Opposition to Martin grew until he was finally expelled. He formed a rival union, taking his followers with him.
There were two splits. There was the split between Martin and the rest, and then after that split, there was a secondary split between the so-called right and left in what became the UAW-CIO. There isn't any question that the communist group was a main feature within the left group. Now, they weren't all communists by any means. Probably 90% were not.
Martin's departure set the stage for a power struggle within the union. His former deputy, Richard Frankenstein, tried to take advantage of the leadership vacuum by forging an alliance with the left.
So Frankenstein got up in front of that convention and said, "Mr. Chairman, I'm making a deal, and it'll take me 10 minutes to finish it." Right in front of her. And they recessed the convention. And Frankenstein and all the top commies gathered in the back of the hall. And I went up, and I said, "What are you bastards doing?" Kleinstone said to me in front of all these guys, "If the day comes when the party's interests require us to destroy the UAW, we will destroy the UAW." And I said, brother, count me on the other side of every fight, and I'm going to stop till we drive you bastards out of this union.
Reuther's battle with the left was suddenly overshadowed when Homer Martin went to General Motors claiming that he represented the auto workers. GM, taking advantage of the rivalry between Martin and the UAW, refused to talk to either of them. Everything the union had fought for was about to be lost. Reuther, determined to force GM's hand, called a strike. The sit-down strike was declared illegal early in 1939, but Reuther was ready with a new tactic. He called out only the tool and die makers, just as GM was retooling for the new 1940 models. With these skilled workers on strike, GM couldn't make cars. Meanwhile, all the other workers remained on the payroll. Time magazine described Reuther's strategy as amputating one finger at a time to cripple a hand.
The union is behind us. We shall not be moved just like the tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved.
When strikebreakers attacked the picket line, Reuther responded with the union's own show of force.
Flying squadrons riding fine, give power and strength to the picket line. We're going to make canoes and sign. Make way for flying squad.
The flying squadron was sort of a defense mechanism. And there's sort of the shock troops. You responded wherever there's difficulty. Practically every local union in those days had a flying squadron. It was a show of force and a show of support.
Faced with the prospect of no new cars in 1940, GM finally gave in. Reuther had scored a double victory, recognition of the UAW and the defeat of Martin's rival union. 9 days later, Martin left the labor movement and allied himself with the Ford Motor Company. Walter Reuther had saved the UAW, but the union's left wing was concerned about his soaring popularity. His battle with the left was suddenly helped by surprising news from Europe. In August of 1939, Joseph Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler. Poland would be divided between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The invasion came in September. Reaction in the United States was devastating. Polish Americans, including the large number of them in the UAW, were outraged. Communism, by allying itself with fascism, lost favor with most leftists in America. The net result within the UAW was a migration toward the political center of the Union, something that Walter Reuther was able to take full advantage of.
Well, I think by then he had sensed the pulse of this country. And the general pulse of this country was that anything red was no good, and anything no good was communist, and it was very easy, sort of red baiting, red dashing, or whatever you want to call it, bashing. And so the easiest way to take care of a political enemy, especially in a worker's atmosphere, was to paint him with a red brush.
Let me be honest. On our side, in local elections or other things, sometimes there was red baiting, which was unjustified. Because if you could nail somebody as a communist, the chances were you could beat him.
Political infighting had diverted the union leaders from their main objective, to organize the last holdout among the big three, to bring into the union the more than 90,000 workers at the giant River Rouge Ford plant.
Don't forget that one of the main reasons that they had to organize Ford is because General Motors and Chrysler told them, if you don't organize Ford, don't sit back at the table to us to get a contract, because this man will sell cars cheap and bust us while we're trying to live up to your standards. So they had to come in and organize.
The attempt to organize Ford would lead to a shocking racial incident. Ford had hired more blacks than any other automaker. and had gained their loyalty by giving money to black causes and by being seen with black heroes.
He knew that one of the popular men in the country, one of the beloved men, was Dr. George Washington Carver. And every year, he'd bring George Washington Carver up, and the newspapers would talk about how these two geniuses would walk through the gardens, and they would talk about science. That won him favor with the churches. It won him favor with the black leaders. But all the time, under all of this, the average black who worked in the foundry, and they were dying at the age of 45 and 50 of tuberculosis, pneumonia, and what have you. What a price to pay so that this could be seen.
Despite their working conditions, the blacks remained loyal to Ford. At least at Ford, they had jobs. But black union organizers set out to convince them that they would benefit by joining the union.
We organized a huge committee, and they hit the streets, and they went into bars, and they went into homes, which was one of the biggest moves of blacks to counteract a situation and call for a unity with whites that I've ever seen, and it won.
Harry Bennett underestimated the strength of an integrated union. On April 1st, 1941, he fired 8 union organizers, and to his astonishment, 1,500 men stopped working. The protests spread. Suddenly, the River Rouge plant was paralyzed. Within hours, it was surrounded by a barricade of cars and a picket line of 10,000 workers. Most of the black workers had walked out with the union, but some, recently hired by Bennett, were still inside the plant.
The rest of the blacks who were in the plant were Ford workers who didn't come out because they were afraid to come out. And they weren't strikebreakers. They were just a bunch of scared people who didn't know what would happen to them if they hit that picket line.
Bennett now ordered the black workers to attack the picket line. Bennett's tactic backfired. The black leaders in Detroit denounced him. The Urban League withdrew its support of Ford, and the NAACP came out in support of the UAW. A race riot had been averted. Guaranteed safety, the blacks gradually came out and joined the union. Bennett's attempt to drive a wedge between the blacks and whites had failed, and Henry Ford was forced, finally, to deal with the UAW.
The ironic part, the minute that he made a decision to let them organize, he gave them the best contract that everybody had. He just went the opposite way. He gave them everything they wanted. No argument at all. Just go ahead and organize whatever you want, you got it.
We're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, we're gonna roll the union on.
In just 5 years, the UAW had organized the big 3 auto companies. It was April 1941, and the UAW looked forward to a new era for the working man.
We're gonna roll right over him. If the scab is in the way, we're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll the union on. We're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, we're gonna roll the union on. We're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, we're gonna roll the union on. We're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, we're gonna roll the union on. We're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, we're gonna roll, we're gonna roll the
The UAW members were now eager to enjoy the benefits they had won. But by the spring of 1941, Europe was at war. Many of the workers were isolationists and wanted no part of it.
And there was a sharp division in our country. There were the American Firsters who were really fascist, who were promoting the point of view, let's keep America out of war, the Yanks are not coming. And the communists in those days, there was a pact between Hitler and Stalin, and the communists were preaching the same line. The Yanks are not coming, it's an imperialistic bloodbath.
Come summer of '41, of course, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, overnight, the party line, the Communist Party line changed, became 2,000 pro-war effort.
Walter Reuther, on the other hand, recognized the danger of Hitler early on, and he was for aid to Britain, and he was for assisting the Allies.
Reuther had a radical idea. Instead of building an aircraft factory from scratch, he argued that the auto industry could quickly convert to war production and promised that the auto workers could turn out 500 planes a day.
And I said, RJ, I got an idea I think is exciting. You're the president of the union, and I think it would be fine if you submitted this to President Roosevelt as the president of our union. Tommy said, well, if you, he says, oh, you're not gonna make a horse's ass out of me. I said, no, RJ, I'm serious. This is a sound idea. Why, he says, you're full of crap, he said.
And nearly every single manufacturer said he's dreaming. Of course, one of the reasons for it is, first of all, they did in fact think he was dreaming. Secondly, they really didn't want to discontinue making automobiles, which were much more profitable than war profits. Yeah, he was ridiculed, but then again, history proved that he was right.
Till then, my darling, please wait for me.
The UAW supported the war. Every worker had a son or a husband or a brother fighting somewhere. The interests of the auto workers had to be protected while they were overseas. When it became apparent that the Allies would win the war, the UAW turned to post-war concerns. Wartime wage controls, coupled with rampant inflation, had weakened the buying power of the American worker.
During the war, the Congress appropriated $400 billion for battleships and bombers to destroy homes and to destroy life. But when we call upon the Congress to appropriate money to help people, they don't appropriate billions and billions. They get out the congressional eyedropper and give us a couple of drops. And we believe that a country that can spend $400 billion to destroy life can afford to spend the same amount of money to make life better.
The UAW was now the largest union in the United States, with more than 1 million members. Walter Reuther intended to use its strength to improve the quality of life for all Americans. He called the first post-war strike against General Motors, and he made a remarkable proposal. He demanded that GM raise workers' wages by 30% without raising the price of cars.
The labor movement, as a matter of sound economics and as a matter of social responsibility, had to, in effect, insist that its wage increases come out of that greater productivity and not out of the pockets of the American consumers through higher prices. And that's for these reasons that I raised the question of wage increases without price increases, because only wage increases in that framework are socially responsible.
A government commission found that General Motors could well afford to raise wages without raising auto prices, but GM refused. On November 21st, 1945, 200,000 auto workers went out on strike.
On the line, on the line, on the picket line, we'll win our fight for the right. On the picket line, on the line, on the line, on the picket line.
Reuther held out for 113 days. Finally, he was forced to accept GM's offer of a wage increase that made no mention of prices. But his effort had touched something in the hearts of the rank-and-file members of his union.
That sunk in to me, you know, because it's not talking about wage increases, it's not talking about seniority, you know, or promotional rights or anything like that. It's putting the rights of the people and the interests of the people there in front of you. So it's a movement, as Phil Murray used to say. This is not just a union, it's a movement.
In 1946, Walter Reuther won the presidency of the UAW by a narrow margin, and the left wing of the union still controlled the executive board.
He's elected with a minority of the board. And the majority, rather than finding a common ground on which they both could work, after all, the union was more important than they were. They seem to have forgotten it. And instead of trying to find a common ground, they went after him. I think they lost a lot of support as a consequence of the vicious tone of the material that was circulated against Walter.
The blow that finally defeated the left wing of the Union came not from the Reuther faction, but from the United States Congress.
Washington is under a virtual state of siege during the closing hours of the Taft-Hartley labor bill fight, as forces of labor staged last-minute demonstrations to defeat the measure. President Truman, after long deliberation, gives his reasons for vetoing the measure.
I would have signed a bill with some doubtful features if, taken as a whole, it had been a good bill. But the Taft-Hartley bill is a shocking piece of legislation.
The Taft-Hartley law allowed any state to outlaw the union shop, making it virtually impossible to unionize in the South. It prohibited unions from making political contributions in national elections. It violated basic civil liberties. No communist could hold a union office. By forcing communists out of the union, it broadened Reuther's base of support, but by imposing limitations on what a union could fight for, it ended Reuther's dream of an unbounded working class. If Reuther couldn't change society, he would at least continue to do all he could to improve the lives of the auto workers. Over the next 23 years, he negotiated pensions, health care, cost of living increases. The standard of living for the auto workers rose to a level they had only dreamed of in 1937.
Oh, sometimes I wonder how far the union would ever have gotten if it hadn't been for Walter Reuther. I just don't think that we had the leadership anywhere else that would have brought us as far as he did, and as effectively and as quickly as he did. It's a number of things. It's just a natural a sense that some people have, a leadership sense that some people have and others don't. There's just something that's inside of a person that comes out at the right time that I just can't explain.
My main point is that the labor movement is about that problem that we face tomorrow morning. The guy has every right to say, damn it, my union has to do something about that problem I've got. I got it right now, today, not tomorrow, right now, and I expect my union to do something. And I think you've got to say to him, you're right, brother, we're going to do something about that. But to make that the sole purpose of the labor movement is to miss the main target. The labor movement is about changing society.
What good is a $1 an hour more in wages if your neighborhood's burning down? What good is another week's vacation if the lake you used to go to, or you get a cottage, is polluted? You can't swim in it. The kids can't play in it. And what good is another $100 pension if the world goes up in atomic smoke in a war? I mean, don't you see, these immediate things, you can't realize them. They have no value excepting in the context of a society and a world in which these values can be given meaning. And so I don't think you have to be noble to look at it. I think that's a pretty practical look at the thing. I may be motivated because I just happen to think that these values are important, and I'm willing to fight for them, and I'm willing to die for them because I believe in them. I've had what I think is the richest self-fulfilling kind of experience that a human being has. I have been living what I believe. I mean, can you ask for more than that?
On May 9th, 1970, Walter Reuther and his wife May were killed in a plane crash. In Detroit, flags were flown at half-staff on city buildings and at the headquarters of General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. In auto plants across the country, the assembly line stopped for 3 minutes while workers paid their respects.
Exclusive corporate funding for American Experience is provided by Liberty Mutual. Major funding is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And viewers like you. Thank you.